And I feel that, you know, that sometimes people put objections to why did people do things this way that are based on not really thinking very carefully about why wouldn't you. Some questions shouldn't be why did they do this. It should be why didn't other people do this.
Yes,
because it within that economy it's so practical. I mean, reading about like the tribes in Iran, where you had tribes that in summer migrated up into the mountains with their herds, and in winter migrated down into the lowland valleys, which were warmer, and there was, you know, there was still some forage in that. They had a whole different economy than, say, Turkish nomads out on the steppe, who had an area where they, in Mongolia at least, in summer you migrate north because it gets warmer there, and in winter you migrate south because the cold is coming in and it's terrible. It sounds very similar, but one group of people went a few hundred miles over very difficult terrain, which is what happened in Iran, and another group of people may have gone 1,000 miles. But on terrain that was much easier to move over. So their structures were different. We call them both nomads, but they're very different. And in Iran, for let's say in the period of the Seljuks, you had full-on steppe nomads, Oghuz tribesmen coming in, and they eventually destroyed the Seljuk kingdom. But on the other hand, in the west, in the Zagros Mountains and places like this, you had this other kind of nomad, which was really old because it had been there for such a long time, even probably before horse riding. And these things somehow managed to work together. It made it very hard for the people who lived in cities and had farms, but it's so much more complex than a quite urbanized, but they weren't as agricultural as, say, the Sasanian Persians were, and they weren't as structured. It's not saying one thing is better than the other. It's just that in history, very complex things happen, and sometimes culture can come back to the surface again, and other times it disappears. I mean, you know, Iran's unusual in that you can linguistically trace the people from the Achaemenids all the way up to modern Persian. There's a continuity, and there are cultural things that are continuous too. But in a lot of the world, it's not like that. In a lot of the world, when people came in, everything changed. I mean, huge numbers of Turks migrated into Iran, and smaller numbers of Mongols. And whereas there are a lot of Turkish-speaking Iranians, it didn't change the culture completely. And when getting back to our subject of archery manuscripts, when you read those archery manuscripts, you can see a very distinct focus on how to shoot and what to do. And you can see how bits and pieces of this have spread all over the place. And on the other hand, things have come in as well, which is what makes it interesting, because you don't have just a puzzle that when you put the jigsaw together, you've got a single picture. You get multiple pictures from each of the little bits, the spices that make the cooking.
Yes, that's right. Let me just go and ask you some things, and so we just tell our readers about, you know, in today's Iran, I mean, Iranians are divided in Iran and outside. And some Iranians are completely interested only in ancient Iran. The others are more interested in Islamic period Iran. I was never like that, because I look at it as a culture, right? A cultural development, not here, before and after. Mm-hmm. But one thing which is interesting, let's talk about archery. I think many Iranian, especially viewers, will be interested in what you're saying here, is about thumb ring archery and also Sassanid draw, right? Remember, we wrote an academic article for a leading academic journal, Rama. This was huge work. Do you remember it? Yes.
It was a lot, because I came to it originally in my life. I had come across things saying certain things about what type of archery was done in Iran based on, as I found out later, either misinterpreted or misunderstood studies. And I had a very low opinion of a certain French archaeologist until I found the article that a lot of confusion had come from that he wrote, which wasn't about what people had taken out of it. This was about some strange little ring-like objects that were found in Luristan. And he interpreted them. In French, it translates as bow-stringing devices. And people who got this thought bow-pulling devices. And when you read the article and look at the illustrations, he was talking about a method of using these things to put the string on reflex bows. When you look at that, and then look at the, say, and this is back in the time of the Assyrians as well, there is a bas-relief of an Assyrian stringing a bow, showing that they did it quite logically without any of this extra technology. They just, one guy knelt down and bent the bow of his knee, and the second guy put the string on, and that's all they did. And it makes perfect sense. A reflex deflex, the Assyrian bows were reflex deflex, so they curved back from the handle and then curved forward again. And when you strung them, they were roughly an isosceles triangle. Quite a difficult bow to string, but not impossible. And but what he'd found, and I'm not going to mention his name because he really is a serious archaeologist who deserves respect for what he did. I mean, this was back in the 50s and no one can blame him for this. What he had found was a very unusual type of buckle that had no moving parts, which involved a strap that went through and over and fitted down on a button, and on the other side the strap was sewn on, and it was for the cheek pieces of a harness. And another scholar proved this quite thoroughly, and therefore this whole thing of Assyrian thumb rings was a misunderstanding. But it still gets quoted today. Yes, because people don't go back and look at where it came from.
Yes.
And you know, there's a lot of things like that. So when you get, what we can't say is what the Sasanians thought about their archery, because we don't have their books, and there were probably a few books written about archery in Sasanian times. What we can say is what Persians after the Arab conquest say, because they wrote books about it, and we know they were using thumb rings. When you look at Persian art, and I'm specifically starting with the embossed silver plates, there is a very clear hand position back here. This finger and that finger are pointing away. The two middle fingers appear to be what is around the string. Now, I made a device that replicated the pattern you could see, and I didn't invent anything for what you couldn't see, and just fitted a tab on it, and it worked. You could shoot with it. It was quite accurate, and you've done it. You know, it's quite a nice way of shooting, actually.
Yes, you made one for me as well. Do you remember? Yes.
Yeah. I've seen you on YouTube using it, and it's a very simple solution. In reality, I think it's possible that rather than a tab as I made it, they may have made finger stalls that were joined and then crossed over, because people like doing things like that. But at least one person pointed out that there's little silver fingertips turned up in a Sasanian inscription. And they said, well, maybe these are for archery. Somebody else noted, and I'm not mentioning names because we don't want to kind of get people, you know, like end up being that person that misquotes somebody ourselves. Somebody else pointed out, well, they're straight. So how do you pull a bowstring if the fingertips go down to there and they're straight and you can't bend your fingers? I think they were for playing a lute. I think they were for playing a musical instrument.
I remember there were many people who said they were type of like rings, like a thumb ring, but for the fingers. I remember that, and they really believed in it.
Yeah. Well, in Saracen archery, there are two, what are assumed to be Phoenician fingertips, and they would just fit over that part of the finger, and they were sewn to something, which was probably like a finger stall. Yeah, they probably were used that way. But the ones from the Sasanian excavation were the finger with the nail down past the joint. So you can't bend that part of the finger, so it's very difficult to use it. I mean, in theory, you could do it like that, where that part was straight, but I think it's stretching a thing until you can prove it, until you've got wear patterns that are from shooting, then you shouldn't, say this is definitely this. This is one of the problems I see in a lot of documentaries and that, where they'll say, here is a shamshir. They don't say, here is what we call a shamshir. Sometimes they do, and they say, oh, and in Farsi, shamshir means sword. It doesn't mean bent sword or straight sword or recurved sword. It means sword. It's the same thing with kılıç in Turkish. It doesn't mean a specific sort of sword. I mean, I think the Turks also adopted a Slavic word, that mich for sword, which probably does mean a straight sword, but it wasn't used that consistently. We, particularly collectors, when something first arrives in a country from another country, they try to find a name for it. And those that are trying to be as authentic as possible try and find a name from the original language, which is a good thing. But when you say to a person, what do you call this? And he says, oh, it's a sword, or Dwyer, or shamshir, or kılıç. I mean, it goes. It's not the thing. There's a whole group of daggers that have names in English that are from Hindi or Farsi or Turkish or Arabic. But if you look at what those words mean in the original language, they're just generic terms, because they said, oh, what's that? It's a sword. It's a dagger. And you've got to be really careful. So I think that from a practical point of view, it's better to say, we call it this now, rather than say, this is its name, because maybe it isn't. Maybe we're talking about something very general. And so I mean, something, go on.
Yeah, so the whole idea was based on the research or assumption that the Achaemenids and Parthians used finger draw, correct? And I remember from National Museum of Iran, I showed you also some of the Parthians who were shooting, and you mentioned these were also, they're using finger draw. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
There were some.
Yeah. There's some little mother of pearl carvings from Jāme, which I think is this is where the big bronze statue came from too, and they're very clearly doing this. They're doing a full long draw, but it's like this. And when you look at it, several hundred years before, in the collapse of the Hittite Empire in the Neo-Hittite states, there was one at a place in Turkey now known as Injili.
Yes.
There is a bas-relief of an archer walking along, holding 3 finger tabs joined by 3 straps to go around the wrist. He's walking along holding it. He's got his bow over his shoulder and a quiver, and he's also got a little kind of rectangular thing that's probably a bracelet for his arm. And it's so much like the modern things. And this was already 200 years before or 300 years before the founding of the Achaemenid Empire. There's no reason that, since we see people being shown shooting before and after with 3 fingers, why would they have used something else and then it dropped out of use and then it reappeared several hundred years later. The logical conclusion is everyone was shooting pretty much that way. The Achaemenids were famous for their archers, so they were obviously good at it. I mean, you know, we see different versions. I mean, Darius, in his inscription at Besetun, says he's proud to be an archer and a spearman. So it's quite clear that the Persians themselves believed this was an important thing. The Greeks, who are our main source for written material about the Achaemenids, aside from the tablets from Persepolis and the Achaemenid inscriptions and that, are very strongly advanced the idea that the Persians were very good archers. I mean, the Greeks themselves didn't have a high regard for archers, but they still said complimentary things about Persian archery, bearing in mind the Persians were their great enemies, so to speak. So they weren't 100% supportive. But it was clear everybody thought they were good archers. And I mean, we try to work out things from, say, Persepolis. The bas-reliefs in Persepolis show two types of bow, a longer bow and a short bow in a garitas. And the long bow is associated with a very long over-the-shoulder quiver, which suggests that it was for a very long draw. Whereas the garitas, the arrows can't be much more than well, in Scythian terms, they were only about 55, 60 centimeters long. They weren't very long at all. So they were just drawn like this, you know. The ones in Persepolis, the garitas look bigger in proportion to the men. So it's possible that maybe these were you know, drawn to the front of the face. In the Alexander sarcophagus, which was made for a king of Sidon or somewhere around in what is now Lebanon, there's a depiction of Persian archers on it, and you can clearly see them drawing like this.
Interesting.
And the Greeks, when they on vase paintings painted Greek archers, their hands were all over the place. So this was done by somebody who went to a lot of trouble. Now, whether it's accurate or not, it's a different thing, but it certainly is something you could justify by saying this would actually work, as opposed to some of the things that are very difficult to justify. I mean, some of the Greek hand positions in vase paintings are more likely to be throwing a curse on someone than shooting an arrow. So you have this thing where you would say the Achaemenids were using a finger release. Then you have the Parthian depictions of archery where they're quite clearly drawing three fingers. There's no doubt that they're using all three fingers. Then you get the Sasanian silver plates, and all of a sudden they're using the middle two fingers.
Yes.
And the thing about that is, what is the advantage of using the middle two fingers? What you've basically done is you've stopped trying to hold the arrow between your fingers. And that means that once you do that, when you release, there's a single point of release. It's like a thumb release in that there's only a single point of release. You get a smoother release. And this was a different solution. But it clearly worked because the Sasanians were well known for their successful archery. But there's an interesting thing. We know that thumb rings were being used in China from the Shang dynasty back in the 1100s BC because they've dug them up. Around about the 500s AD CE, the Western Turkish Khaganate established control in Central Asia as over the top of the Caspian Sea, and actually I think some of their armies reached the Crimea. Now, that southern Turkish expansion is associated with thumb rings. And it's hard to believe that in the 500s, late 500s and that, with the wars that went backwards and forwards. I mean, at one stage, the Turks and the Sasanians allied against the Hephthalites. At another stage, they fought each other. That there wasn't an interchange of ideas. Whether it was concentrated in the East or whether it spread throughout the empire, it's very hard to say. But you know, the more you look at it, the more likely it seems that towards the end of the Sasanian Empire, they started to change. But when you look at the bas-reliefs of whom it is assumed to be Khusraw Parviz, shooting when he's hunting in the big bas-reliefs at Taki Bustan, I think. If you look really carefully, the hand where he's shooting at wild boar or whatever is pretty much abraded, and you could say, oh, he's using a thumb release. But when you look really closely, you can see the string going in there. And I mean, it may be that the artist just did it that way because that's what they were used to doing. But you can't say, well, we've got evidence of this, but it might be evidence of something else. It has to be only evidence of what it shows. You can't make this leap of cognition to say, oh, it's this thing. I mean, there's so many interesting things that we find. I mean, go on.
I think this is interesting, you know, what you say, because I would like to bring this up because we discussed about it as well. I mean, I don't speak Armenian, but once I was invited by Armenians in Italy. They have a big collection. There were some monks, and they told me, and then later on I checked with some other Armenian colleagues, that Armenian language is like some Persian in a way that you can read many old texts. I'm not talking about technical texts. For example, let's say Shahnameh.
Yes.
You don't need to be very educated, and Shahnameh is very well written. But every Iranian, every Persian can read Shahnameh. It's not like, you know, imagine in English, we know that. Just try to read something from 17th, 18th century in English. You don't need to go to the 10th century, right? I mean, God, you need to be a linguist for English.
Well, I mean,
right?
Most people can't read the Canterbury Tales, which were written in the 14th century. I mean,
exactly.
They can be shown how they're related to modern English, but they can't read it.
Right.
Because English has changed a lot.
A lot. And then when we come to a conservative, rich language like Persian or Armenian, because Armenian colleagues told me it's the same, in Shahnameh, Book of Kings, which is Ferdowsi himself said that it was based on an older book, right, that he relied on. They clearly talk about as shast raha kardan, shast, which is our thumb, that to release from the thumb. When they talk about, okay, they don't say thumb ring, they say first the release from the thumb, right? And then we have also in today's Persian as shast raha kardan, zarb shast, we have it still, okay. Today's Persian, which can come from later period, means the power of the thumb, right? And then when we think about it, and then they also talk in Shahnameh about this, right? That they should, and they talk about zehgir, which is the thumb ring, right? So what do you think? What are they talking about? Are they referring to the later period of Sassanid archery and period? That's which is something very interesting to think about.
Well, if you look at it from a point of view of how many years between the first contacts with the Western Turks and when the Shahnameh is written, and we're talking about almost 500 years.
Yes.
So within that 500 years, the stories could have been updated. Because if you've got, bearing in mind that a lot of this stuff, if you go back to the Parthian era, you had professional poets who would memorize all the heroic tales